Business organization Sakeliga says race-based regulations against contractors at SOEs are unacceptable. Regulations allow parastatals to preemptively disqualify contractors if they are not 51% black-owned. Sakeliga approached the South Gauteng High Court to overturn a decision to deny a contractor using the regulations. That application and a subsequent appeal was denied. It now intends approaching the Supreme Court of Appeal. For more on this, we are joined by Sakeliga's Daniel du Plessis from our Pretoria studios. Good evening, Daniel. Thank you very much for your time. Tell us, you have an issue with this, what you call, and I quote, arbitrary minimum BEE requirements a contractor must meet if it wants to do business with SOEs. Why are you calling these requirements arbitrary?
Oh, so that's actually a really good question. Part of the reason which we call them arbitrary is because there's no real policy in line to determine when they're applied and when not. So you get a situation, as we've seen in the past, where mission-critical services are actually farmed out on the basis of these requirements, which means that it's not only 51% owned. It might be, for instance, that a company is majority black owned, but might not be level 1 BEE. And accordingly, because it's not level 1 BEE, even though it might be managed by black people, owned by black people, it's not sufficiently transformed to actually get the state's business. That seems a bit arbitrary. If it's about transformation, that just doesn't seem to add up.
But, I mean, shouldn't you then, because the way I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're fighting these requirements and not so much trying to perhaps help get them to make sense?
So the important thing to remember is the economy is everyone's baby, and it's an important thing South Africa needs to focus on. These regulations are actively costing us money. What it comes down to is there are certain priorities which are inserted into the procurement process. These priorities do not align with what would be traditionally considered to be the main issue at stake, namely price and function. In other words, instead of just focusing on price and function, we've got additional requirements. Now that means we're paying a premium. We're paying more money for services than we would normally do. And currently in South Africa's position, that doesn't necessarily make sense. We've got a situation where the great majority of South Africa's municipalities are financially vulnerable. In addition, a similar report by the Auditor General in 2018 found that more than 50% only about 50% of state departments are actually financially healthy as well. Can we afford to keep on paying more than we should to a small minority of business owners who are advantaged by these procurement policies, or should we focus on developing the South African economy as a whole for the benefit of all who partake in it?
But let's just say, for a second, one accepts your argument, even if it's perhaps only to an extent. But if one considers the primary aim of this, it is, among other things, to ensure that what was white privilege under apartheid is actually done away with. It is to ensure that white people don't continue to unduly benefit from the system, even if it's under the guise of price or value proposition. Now, you don't think that perhaps there should be at least two things that you focus on instead of approaching it the way you have. And one is to ensure that the wrongs you're seeing with the regulations are the things that get corrected. And then secondly, actually encourage your members to actually take on board, the kinds of black partners, that can actually add both to your value proposition and to everything else, in fact, that you have to do.
See, these pre-qualifications are exactly what is wrong with the current regulations, amongst other things, but that's a real big issue here. And so what we're trying to do is to get rid of what's the big problem. If we get these race-based exclusions, that leads to a knock-on effect, several knock-on effects, which have diverse adverse consequences for the South African economy, but especially for the SOEs and public institutions which apply these policies. But to get to your second point, I think in South Africa's context, it makes sense to do business to people who can help you create as much value as possible for the South African economy. And that's going to be a diverse number of people from diverse groups. The current regulations, we're not even talking about BE in general here, remember, we're talking about hard and fast BE racial exclusions. So let me maybe sketch the situation to make clear what the actual position on the ground is. You have situations, and there are a number of companies in this position, which are majority black owned, who are managed by black people, who employ majority black people, but who cannot actually qualify to do government work because they've got a level 2 rating. Now, this is a problem, and regardless of what we intend to do with the policies, we must look at what the policy's actual effect is. And yes, while we might actually get rid of certain white companies who are doing business with the state, are we really empowering South Africans as a whole? And are we empowering the vast majority of black South Africans? Now, in the context of many states which have applied similar policies, we find that there exists a creamy layer that finds themselves in a very advantageous position. They have had several adventures in the private sector and several political connections. So even though they might be from a marginalized group, they've got better access than most people in the country at that point. And what turns out is the case in the countries such as India, for instance, is you find that the vast majority of state procurement and contracts actually go to these small numbers of people. And it's no surprise then that the data actually bears this out. South Africa is becoming more unequal, largely, I think, due to policies such as these. And so we must consider what actually will be the solution to the problems we're facing. We can apply these policies all we like, but if it means that Eskom, for instance, is not financially sustainable, that ultimately will just harm the entire economy and everyone who lives in South Africa.
I mean, very briefly, I think the problems of political connectedness and corruption are well known, and that's what everybody has been complaining about, except, of course, those who benefit, from that system. But do you not think that even by calling this race-based disqualification, perhaps alienate even those people who may actually share your concerns?
So it's important to remember that the primary issue here is the mechanism in which it actually does function. And that is a problem. So what it comes down to is companies which may be black companies in any sense of the word may still be disqualified from doing business with the state because they're still too white. That's not about representativity anymore. The actual function of the procurement policy in that case is to exclude people from the economy. We're facing challenges in South Africa, many challenges with SOEs and municipalities. And we've got a lot of people who've got the knowledge and the skills and the capital to actually invest in South Africa. And so it's no surprise to hear the President calling for investment. And it's no surprise to hear the Minister of Public Enterprises calling for all hands on deck to solve the problem. But what these regulations do is they actually limit the number of people and the kinds of people who can contribute to making South Africa a better place. That just doesn't make sense. And what it comes down to is alienating the people who really matter in South Africa. The dispossessed, the poor who get no services, and the private business owners who can actually contribute to making tomorrow a better day.
Daniel, thanks very much for your time this evening. Daniel du Plessis, who is from Sakeliga, they're contesting regulations allowing what they call race-based disqualification of contractors at SOEs.